Hi, my name is Sofia Resnick. I'm a reporter for the American Independent here in Washington, D.C.
I'm John Tomasic. I'm a reporter for the Colorado Independent, one of the sites that's part of the American Independent News Network.
Right, and the American Independent News Network is a network of investigative news sites across the country. And we tend to focus on politics and on social justice issues. And as today is Support Your Media Day, we're asking for your support to help us continue our investigative news coverage. And one of the things that John and I are here to talk about today is reproductive health and reproductive rights, which is one of the issues that the American Independent News Network focuses on, especially in the last 2 years, as this has been a pretty big issue across the country, with legislatures enacting pieces of legislation and new bills that restrict access to abortion, to contraception, and sometimes even to family planning services by cutting grants to Planned Parenthood and other family planning providers. And within this subject area is a few years old initiative called Personhood, which has been pretty highly publicized across the country, but still many people don't understand the groups behind this initiative, who's funding it, and what the real political intentions are. And that's one of the things that our network is really trying to work on and to move the debate in that direction, looking at why personhood, and who is funding this initiative. And for those of you who don't really know what personhood is, you hear it, in the news a lot, but you don't really understand what it is. Basically, it's an attempt to define a human as beginning at the moment of conception. In some cases, I mean, the language varies from state to state, as we'll talk about in a minute. But in some cases, it's just as simple as when the sperm and the egg unite. That's the definition of a person, which would make abortion essentially murder and would make it illegal. And some critics of these initiatives also believe that it could make certain forms of contraception, hormonal birth control, illegal as well, which has made it pretty supremely controversial. And just yesterday, in case you missed it, the Virginia legislature in the House, they passed essentially a personhood bill, and now it moves on to the Senate. And Virginia recently got a Republican supermajority, so it has a chance to pass. And but unlike Virginia, other states are trying to enact personhood legislation through the ballot. And John here is here to tell us about what's happening in Colorado.
Yeah, Sophia, it was funny, you mentioned that people don't really know what personhood is, and part of that, I think, is because the language around personhood generated by the personhood community changes, and that's what we've seen in Colorado. Colorado's kind of become ground zero for the personhood movement. Partly, I think, we've had, in 2008 and 2010, we've had ballot initiatives where personhood was put up for a vote. And now we're having another one. This is the third try in Colorado. And partly, I think that's because we have a very loose ballot initiative system. It doesn't take a lot of signatures to get on the ballot. And also because there's this constellation of kind of big money, high profile personhood groups headquartered here in the state. So yeah, it's personhood all the time here, even though it's a purple state. We have a lot of Christian right evangelicals, but we also have a lot of other kinds of people with a lot of different ideas. So this year's initiative is interesting because they've kind of tweaked the language in the wake of the personhood ballot initiative failing in Mississippi. But that language seems to have done more damage than good in this case. The personhood initiative here has already attracted a Supreme Court, or spurred a Supreme Court challenge by Planned Parenthood that says the language is just too vague. People won't know what they're voting on. And also, the personhood language hasn't addressed the main concerns for voters, which is, are they voting to outlaw abortion, or are they voting to outlaw contraception, fertilization efforts, end-of-life decision-making? The language is just really sweeping. It's basically, you know, from conception to end of life. You can't kill an innocent person.
And are you saying that the language now is more vague than it was in the last two times that the state enacted this ballot initiative?
Well, it's a good question. I think they've tried to make it more clear, but it's still muddy, and it's kind of muddy in a more sweeping way. So, for instance, the Legislative Council here has to review all ballot initiatives, and the ballot initiative, the Personhood initiative this year says, the intentional killing of any innocent person is prohibited. Well, so the lawyers at the Capitol were saying, well, what's an innocent person? You know, does this somehow legalize vigilantism? You know, if the community feels someone's guilty, can they go and you know, grab them and kill them? I mean, is that legal suddenly? But just putting this personhood initiative, the language of it, into conversation with the rest of the laws on the books in Colorado just raises all these issues. But, you know, they've tried, I think, to make it clearer, but I think they're struggling. The movement is struggling to do that, to say this is about abortion. But I think some of their other ideas are naturally bleeding into it. Ideas about contraception, ideas about sex, ideas about in vitro fertilization, ideas about stem cell research, etc. So it's become a muddier issue than I think even they want, and I don't think that they feel they can state it exactly clearly, because voters just will turn it down, and that's been the case. This initiative has lost in Colorado by a 3-to-1 vote. So 70% of the people have voted against it in 2008 and in 2010, which was the GOP wave election. So it's unpopular here, and but that will not slow it down. It's sure to come back time and again.
And it's funny because you know, as you're stating that, it's already failed twice in Colorado, and more than that, you know, Colorado has a Democratic governor, a Democratic-controlled Senate, but in Mississippi, you know, Mississippi has a Republican governor, a Republican-controlled House and Senate, and in Mississippi, it's hard on its face just to get an abortion. There's only one surgical abortion clinic in the entire state. They have a pretty narrow limit on when you can have an abortion. They cap it at 12 weeks. And because of that, the rate of abortions in Mississippi is low. According to the Guttmacher Institute, in 2008, only 5% of all pregnancies that happen of women of reproductive age ended in abortion. And compare that within Colorado, same year, same sample size, was 16%. Nationwide, it was 19%. So in Mississippi, it's interesting that it seems like they have more in there. They have more reason to illegalize or to criminalize abortion, since it's a rare case anyway, and it's a super conservative state. And yet, Colorado is much more liberal, has more access. It's already failed twice. So why the third time?
I think it's just it's a part of a grander strategy, and I think the point is, if you keep bringing it back, people become more used to it, and maybe the ideas will become more mainstream. But you know, it's interesting here. You mentioned Mississippi, which is a very conservative, very Republican state, and Colorado's just not that way anymore, and it's a more libertarian state. But personhood was initially kind of pitched as an issue that was outside the two-party system. It wasn't a Republican issue. It wasn't really a Democratic issue, sort of. But now, these days, it's become increasingly partisan and increasingly a Republican issue. You know, they've hosted these presidential debates in South Carolina and so forth. Personhood USA is headquartered in Colorado, so is Focus on the Family, so is Colorado Right to Life. And these organizations are increasingly associated with the Republican Party and the Republican Party's ideology, which has become a sort of trap for Republicans here, Republican candidates, because it's funny, the evolution is really telling. In 2008, a lot of the mainstream candidates for office, Republicans, were not for personhood. They said, it was too radical. In 2010, the Tea Party wave election, all the mainstream candidates in Colorado were for the personhood measure. The personhood movement people are very organized and very intense, and it's become a kind of a litmus test during the primary election season for Republicans. And it's, if they're not for it, they get a lot of flack from these groups, and they're really painted as kind of lefty pinkos and, baby killers. So it's a real litmus test, and it's a real trap, I think, for them. It's a minefield. The biggest case is Ken Buck, who ran for the Senate last election in 2010. And he was for personhood in the primary. And then in the general election, he tried to, back off of that position. And nevertheless, he lost the vote among women by 17 percentage points. So it was a defining issue. And I just think it's really hard for Republicans to deal with it now. I mean, it's unpopular in the state.
Yeah, it's fascinating, and I think we should also mention that Mississippi got national attention for the ballot measure, and Colorado's getting a lot of attention, but there are measures across the country that will show up this November at the ballot box in the election. And some of those states are, just so you know, Alabama, Arkansas, California, Georgia, Kansas, Montana, Ohio, Oklahoma, and we've already mentioned Colorado. And then in other states, measures failed, like Alaska, Florida, North Dakota, and Utah. So it's interesting to see how things will shape up across the country. But in your own reporting, John, what's one thing that you are really interested in finding, or what are you looking for?
I guess, like you said, who are the people behind it? What are their intentions? Clearly, as you say, it's been failing around the country for years, but it seems to be part of a larger strategy. A lot of people have said, including people in the personhood movement, that it's part of a larger legal strategy to put this question before the Supreme Court. So I guess I'm just interested in that strategy and how it will be accepted by the public. I think it seems like eventually they'll get this measure on the books somewhere, and probably through a legislative system, a referendum or a law. But what it will mean and how much money is being made and spent in these campaigns is also a fascinating aspect of this. Who are the donors? How much are they giving? I know that it's really expensive in Colorado. It's $1 million on either side every time this ballot comes up, this issue comes up. So I think it's just an interesting, not only political but cultural story. And to be writing this story in 2012, when Roe v. Wade is now 40 years old, it's fascinating. It's a fascinating aspect of our culture. American culture.
Yeah, it is really interesting, and it'll be interesting too to see within the pro-life movement also what this personhood movement does for their own movement, since there has been a lot of controversy among them. Even Phyllis Schlafly's Eagle Forum has been opposed to personhood initiatives just because the language is vague, and there some people who are against abortion rights and want abortion to go away are worried that if it does reach the Supreme Court, the court will shoot it down and perhaps make abortion even less restrictive. than these groups want it to be.
Exactly, it can backfire. And I think that's what happened here with the end-of-life questions that it raised. The Catholic Church, some of the Catholic Church representatives were not so keen on that, that those decisions at the end of life, the government really shouldn't have anything to do with that. And they were just more vague, and that kind of broke off a lot of Catholics, I think. But yeah, it's a really interesting story, and I look forward to writing a lot more about it.
As do I. Well, we'll leave it there, but thank you so much for joining us this morning, and we hope that you visit our network, the American Independent News Network, and support your media. Thank you.
Bye, Sofia.
Bye, John.